Now, the title of this talk is Stuck in the Middle with You, and I'm going to effectively use the same joke that Tony used before, which is that I'm stuck in the middle with you in more ways than one, and that I am now officially the last thing between you and lunch. I don't know if that's what lunch is going to look like. That was the best picture I got. So I figured that if I was going to be the last thing between you and lunch, I would just go through 340 slides, right? But that I would keep you interested, hopefully, because I promise you within these 340 slides that there will be some pictures of cats. Because this is the internet that we're talking about, and I'm pretty sure that there's a law somewhere that says if you're going to be talking about the internet, you need pictures of cats. You'll see more than just these. Also, I hope that in going through these 340 slides, I'll be able to keep you interested because we're going to go fairly quickly through those 340 slides. We're already on 41 out of 340 because I know some of you may have lost count somewhere along the way. So buckle up. Here we go into what we are really talking about today when I'm talking about being stuck in the middle with you. And I'm going to start with actually a warning that the thing that I'm going to talk about, the phrase that I'm going to use over and over again, is going to sound really, really boring. Like it's something that you don't want to pay attention to. And yet, it's actually really, really important. I'm going to try and convince you of that today if you're not already convinced of that. And the thing that sounds very boring is this thing called intermediary liability protection. Again, I said it, I know, it sounds really, really boring. But it's actually the legal underpinning, that's the Supreme Court, if you don't recognize the building, of the entire internet. It's the legal underpinning of basically everything that as an industry we do, that everything people in this room do. I'm going to assume that because we're at World Hosting Days, many of you already know what intermediary liability protection is about, and also why it's one of the most important things, and it's really important to know about it. But I also recognize that some of you in the room might not, might be looking around a little confused about why I'm assuming that you would know this, and so I'll give you a quick primer on what it is and why it's so important. You, everyone in this room, and everyone in the next room, and everyone at this conference are intermediaries. If you're doing hosting, registering domains, offering services above it, anything that involves having a customer use your service to do something online makes you an intermediary. And intermediary liability protection, very simply, just means that if one of your users does something that's illegal, breaks the law, that you don't get blamed for it. Now, at least, that is, that you don't get blamed under the law. Certainly, people can complain and people can argue and people will and do that, but under the law, you are protected. Now, some of us, and I'm very much putting myself in this category, think that this is pure common sense. And if you think about it, I would argue that it should be common sense and that you should understand this and you should just recognize that this is inherently true. The idea that when something goes wrong, when someone breaks the law online, who do you blame? Do you blame the tool, or do you focus on whoever actually broke the law with that tool? So it seems like common sense that you should blame whoever actually broke the law. Unfortunately, as I think lots of us have discovered over however long that we've been alive or been on the internet, common sense isn't always so common, unfortunately. And so what we saw were that different platforms early on in the internet era were sued over actions of their users. And there were a bunch of these lawsuits, mostly in the early 1990s. And they were sued over, specifically actions of their users. And I'm going to talk about one case, which was sort of a key case in all of this, from 1995. The decision was in 1995. I forget exactly when it was filed, but 93 or 94. The decision was in 95. And it's a case called Stratton Oakmont versus Prodigy Services. Now, I assume most of you in the room remember Prodigy Services. It was one of the early internet service providers. It was one of the first ways that lots of people got online in the 1990s. Now, you might also recognize the name Stratton Oakmont. If you do, and if it sounds familiar to you, it might be because you saw the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. The firm that is depicted in that movie is Stratton Oakmont. There's some dispute about how accurate the movie is, and I believe there may even be a lawsuit over that. But the firm depicted there is Stratton Oakmont, so you get a sense of what sort of Wall Street firm this was. And Prodigy, among many other services that it offered forums. And they offered a forum where people could talk about money issues. And some people in that forum talked about Stratton Oakmont and had opinions on whether or not Stratton Oakmont was a good company to work with or not. Stratton Oakmont was not so happy with that. And therefore they sued Prodigy. And what came out in this ruling in 1995 is fairly important. I had it here, I don't know if people can see it, but it says that Prodigy should be determined to be the publisher of this topic for the purpose of libel law. That they are responsible for the text that was written by one of their users in the forum. So think about that now. Prodigy, the service provider that is not creating the content, is just creating this forum that people can use, which is the intermediary in this case, is declared the publisher of that content and therefore potentially liable for it if it is defamatory. Now, the reaction from intermediaries and from everyone else for being blamed, for you guys getting blamed for this kind of stuff, was, the reaction from lawyers, from various companies, from people who believed in sort of internet freedom and supported the internet in the early days. The reaction was something akin to this. Just the absolute terror of what this would mean for any kind of open internet service, any kind of user-generated content, any kind of forum, any kind of company that was providing these kinds of services that was about to make the internet, as powerful as it could be. And so this was clearly really bad news for the internet, this one case. So platforms and services suddenly realized that they would have a huge liability if they operated anything that allowed any user on there, any of their users to say anything. So go through 340 slides, you might forget a few in the middle. So if they broke the law, suddenly these services could get blamed. Now thankfully this is actually one of the rare cases where you had a sort of a bad ruling and Congress actually stepped up and did the right thing. They saw this happen and they said, we need to fix this. You had two congressmen in particular at the time, then Congressman, now Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, and then Congressman, now not in Congress, Chris Cox, who stepped up and they wrote a law. And the law became CDA 230, which is here declared the most important law protecting internet speech. And I'm going to explain why that is in a second and why this is so important. Now, there's a longer history behind CDA and CDA 230. CDA stands for Communications Decency Act. CDA 230 was one piece of it. The much larger bill of the Communications Decency Act was actually filled with a whole bunch of really horrible stuff. Almost all of it was bad. Thankfully, almost all of it also got thrown out as unconstitutional. The one part of the law that remains is CDA 230, which is super important, which I'm about to talk about. So, and the key part of CDA 230 is Section C, which is here, and there are two parts to it. And I'm going to talk about both because one of the things that I think is interesting but slightly unfortunate is that when people talk about CDA 230 and intermediary liability protection and what it provides, they focus on the first part of CDA 230 Section C and not the second part. And I think it's the combination of both that is really important and that needs to be understood. And when you don't understand it, bad things happen, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later too. The first part is basically solving the Prodigy problem, the Stratton Oakmont Prodigy problem, which it says that if you're a platform, you don't get blamed for the speech of your users. Very simple, very straightforward. It is a blanket immunity that if you're a platform, if you're a service provider, computer service provider, you don't get blamed for the actions of your users. Very simple. The second part gets much less attention, but is equally, if not more important. And it's what's sometimes referred to as the Good Samaritan Clause, even though the whole section is technically titled Good Samaritan Blocking. And this says that if you do decide to do any moderation, if you do decide to take down content, or if you do decide to leave up content, that doesn't change part one. It doesn't suddenly increase liability. If you decide to take something down that you shouldn't have, that doesn't give you liability. If you decide to leave up something that you should have taken down, that doesn't increase liability. Your choices are yours to make as an intermediary. And that becomes really, really important because it actually encourages platforms to decide for themselves and to determine what level, and actually gives them incentives to take down content that they feel is dangerous or bad or breaks the law. They get to make that decision. There's no risk to them. Legal risk, that is. And what this means is that intermediaries get to decide without adding those new legal liabilities. What it doesn't mean, what some people think it means, but what it does not mean is that platforms never moderate content. In fact, because of Section 230C2, lots of platforms do moderate because they know that it doesn't increase their liability, it doesn't put them at bigger risk, and they make those choices because they can. Now, this goes in contrast to a number of other intermediary liability laws around the world, including other ones even within the US. One of the things about Section 230 is that it has an explicit carve-out for intellectual property issues. And so we have a separate intermediary liability protection law for copyright, which is the DMCA, technically the DMCA 512, and that's actually a little different than CDA 230. It actually requires a takedown. If you want to avoid liability, you have to take down the content. It's a notice and takedown system. You receive a notice, you take it down, and therefore you avoid liability. And I'm going to talk about why those differences matter in a little bit, but we'll get back to it. But when I talk about being stuck in the middle with you, this is not a negative thing, being stuck here. What I'm really trying to say is that we should be celebrating kind of what intermediaries on the internet and what intermediary liability protection has done and why it's so important. And so there are two key reasons that I'm going to talk about now about why this has been so important. And the first has to do with free speech. And the second has to do with the massive economic growth that intermediary liability protections have created. So we'll start with the free speech question. Without CDA 230, without the protections of the platforms in the middle, we'd be unlikely to have some of these pictures of cats. Because the risk and liability that goes along with allowing people to upload content to the internet, which is sort of the basis of what makes the internet work and what makes the internet so powerful, would make that almost impossible. Many of the companies in this room wouldn't exist. Or if they did, they would exist in very limited ways. User-generated content, the thing that really powered the internet and made it so important, and still does today, would be risky for any platform to host. And you'd have a situation where lawyers, specifically, would look like this and freak out about the idea of you hosting anyone else's content that might be illegal. And when lawyers get like that, stuff does not get done. So as a quick aside, all these pictures of cats that I've been using, if you're wondering, they came from a user-generated content site called Pixabay, where people get to upload public domain images. These are images with no copyright whatsoever. This kind of site almost certainly would not exist without these intermediary liability protections, because they would be at risk of getting sued and taken down. So these protections help you, the intermediaries in this room, enable free speech online. You enable the fact that the internet as a platform has become this great source of free speech online, and to do so without fear of liability and getting sued, or if you get sued, being able to get out of those cases very, very quickly. Now it's important to note, and I sort of said this a little bit before, but I want to repeat because it's something that keeps getting confused in all of this. This does not mean that there's no responsibility online. Some people make this argument when they see Section 230, when they see intermediary liability protections, they say, with that nobody takes any responsibility and you have all this bad content online. Or they'll say that there's no legal recourse if someone breaks the law online. That's not true. It means that it's just that the intermediaries, you guys, don't get blamed for it legally. Under the law, if the end user, if a user of one of these services actually does break the law in some way, they are still absolutely liable. There is still recourse. And importantly, you guys still get to decide what you host on your platform and what you decide not to host. So what speech is allowed and what you have, thanks to Section C2. And what we found as you look around the world, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, the weaker intermediary liability protections are around the globe, you see the weaker free speech is in those areas. And even in the US, we see some differences. I talked earlier about the differences between CDA 230 and DMCA 512. And what you see between those differences is a vast difference in terms of speech and silencing speech and using censorship. There's a report that came out about a year and a half ago called Notice and Takedown Everyday Practice. There's 3 academics who went through a few different databases of online information about takedown notices, mostly in the copyright space, and looking at how legitimate they were. And again, in the copyright space, you have it set up where intermediaries, in order to avoid liability, are incentivized to take down content. And what they found was there were millions of problematic takedowns. Millions of takedown notices that had nothing to do with copyright, but were merely trying to censor content and merely trying to silence certain kinds of speech. But because the DMCA requires takedown to avoid liability, many intermediaries will do it just to keep the lawyers from making that face that I had up before. So what we found is that when you have a method to take down content, it gets used to take down content. And often, it does so in a way that stifles free speech, perfectly legal speech. And that should be a concern if we believe in free speech. And there are many articles like this, but I just threw up one here. This is how copyright law is being misused to remove material from the internet. If you look around, you can find many, many examples of this. And I've written many stories about it as well. So there's sort of a simple rule that I have when thinking about these kinds of laws and the protections, which is that if you give someone the power to censor, it will be abused. And over and over and over again, we see it being abused. So the second reason why this stuff is so important, why I mentioned at the beginning, or earlier, is because of the massive economic growth that has been enabled by this. Because specifically of intermediary liability protections. Because of the protections that you guys have that allow you to exist. And not just you, but all of the businesses that then rely on you and build on the services that you guys have, that depend on you. They can exist. This was an article in the Washington Post from a couple years ago that's talking about CDA 230, and it talks about how 2 members of Congress helped create $1 trillion or so worth of value. And this was sort of an estimate. But just a couple months ago, a research group called NERA Economic Consulting put out this very interesting report, Economic Value of Internet Intermediaries and the Role of Liability Protections, and it more or less confirmed the advantage and the benefit of strong intermediary liability protections. It talks about $1 trillion in value per year from the internet economy, and then goes deep, does a kind of a deep dive into some of the benefits and categorizes it and quantifies it in terms of jobs and contribution to GDP and a variety of other things. My own think tank, the Copy Institute, we've been working on some research on this as well. I had hoped to have it done to talk about here specifically when we first set up this talk. It's not quite done. I'm still going to share a couple things from it, and there'll be more details when the actual reports come out. But the research that we're focusing on is specifically what's called the impact of exogenous shocks. These are changes to intermediary liability, whether it's someone changing the law, what happens before and what happens after, or if there's a ruling in a lawsuit that sort of changes the way people look at intermediary liability protections and determines, what happens to the economics, what happens to the market for internet platforms and intermediaries themselves. And what we see over and over and over again when we look at all of those things is that the more intermediary liability protection that you have, the better it is for just about everything, honestly. But it's better for the internet, it's better for the economy, and it's better for innovation as a whole. So I'll give 2 quick examples from the report, and I'm going to give sort of a very brief overlay of them, but again, when the report comes out very, very soon, I swear, you can see these in more detail. But the 2 examples, the first one is in Argentina. There was a key ruling a few years ago, I think the ruling was in 2014 now, that said intermediary liability protections exist. Basically, it was sort of up in the air how strong they were in Argentina, if they really existed, and the ruling said that they did, thereby protecting intermediary liability. And we saw an immediate, almost shocking increase in investment in internet platforms. Basically, as soon as that ruling came out and people knew that those platforms were legit and they weren't going to get sued out of existence, we saw in both the public markets and the private markets that there was investment into internet platforms, which is a very, very dramatic increase. A second example that we have in the report, where we compare differences in laws across different areas, we do one where we compare the US and the EU. Now the US, as I talked about, we did Section 230 in 1996. The EU has intermediary liability protections written into the law as well. They did it in their e-commerce directive in 2000. There's a little bit of lag between the two. Now, what we saw was, with both of these investment into internet platforms, there was a lag between the creation of the intermediary liability protections and then sort of increased investment into user-generated content, intermediary platforms. And some of that we think is because these laws and the new protections were kind of challenged. There was a famous lawsuit against AOL that challenged CDA 230, and so there were some questions there, but once it was kind of settled, you suddenly see the investment rise. And the lag really between like investment sort of taking off was about 5 years from the passing law, and it happened in both the US and the EU. So for example, we used a marker of about $50 million in venture capital investments in the US. It hit venture capital $50 million into specifically into internet platforms for user-generated content. So a subset of, it's not all VC, but it's VC into user-generated content platforms. It hit about $50 million in 2001, which is 5 years after 1996 when CDA 230 was passed. The EU, you have the same, approximately $50 million, converting from euros in 2005, which again is sort of 5 years, 2000. So we see, very interesting, even though there's a 4-year gap between these liability protections being passed, you see this sort of same curve. But what's interesting is actually that the EU curve, the growth curve, then becomes slower. The US kind of takes off and grows really, really rapidly. The EU still grows, but not nearly as rapidly as the US one. And what we saw was that the EU protections are not as strong as CDA 230, so they're a little bit weaker than the US's. And so you can see there are obviously a number of factors involved here, not all of which are intermediary liability, but as you try and parse them out and figure out what are the differences and why, the stronger intermediary liability protection in the US clearly had an impact on it. So to recap, intermediary liability protection is super, super important. I keep repeating it, but I want to make sure that this is driven home very strongly. It's important for a variety of reasons. It's important because it protects free speech, lets you have pictures of cats online. It's important because of the economic value. It's important to all of you in this room because it allows you to exist without getting blamed. And now, I wish, in an ideal world, this is where my presentation would end. This is where I would stop, and we would all be happy, and we'd celebrate the internet and intermediaries and all of you guys, and this is great. But unfortunately, this is not the end of my presentation, because intermediary liability protection and all these wonderful things that I've been talking about are actually very much under attack. And very much under attack around the globe right now, and it's something that we should be very concerned about. Part of this is, as you may have noticed, unfortunately, the internet is not all about pictures of cats and cute, fuzzy, cuddly things online. There are also some not so nice things online, and not very good things online, and this is of great concern to many people, completely legitimately. But it's become very easy, especially lately, and especially for politicians, though not solely politicians, to figure out if we're going to blame someone, why not blame the intermediaries? They're the most obvious ones, it's easy to point to them, it's easy to see them, and it's easy to blame them for the actions of their users. So for example, I have a couple examples of where it's being attacked right now. In Germany right now, they just passed a new law that allows criminal charges against internet platforms if they don't remove content fast enough. That can be a little bit scary. There are also fines associated, but also criminal charges. The EU as a whole, they're sort of attacking intermediary liability protections in a number of different ways, one of which is they're debating a new copyright directive. Now the e-commerce directive protects intermediary liability. This new copyright directive basically chips away at that. There are a number of different proposals out there. The most recent one leaked last week. It's pretty scary. There are a lot of problems for intermediary liability protections. They claim it doesn't conflict, but it absolutely does. One aspect of the thing that leaked last week is that they have mandatory filter requirements. Platforms have to put in filters. They have to pay for it. These are really, really expensive, often not necessary, often very bad at what they do. And if you don't filter correctly, then you could face liability. That's going to be a big problem for intermediaries. In the US, there's a bill that's being debated right now, and this is happening as we speak, called CESTA. And I want to talk briefly about CESTA because I think it's actually the biggest threat to intermediary liability protections in the US right now. It should be a very big concern. CESTA stands for the Stop Exploiting Sex Trafficking Act, which, look, let's face it, that sounds good, right? I don't think anyone, I certainly hope no one, is for exploiting sex trafficking or, you know, supporting sex trafficking. I think we're all, hopefully, against that and support anything that would stop it. The problem is that the reality of this bill is that it destroys intermediary liability protections. In fact, the entire bill is basically an amendment to Section 230 that I was talking about is so important, and will do so in a way that does a lot more harm than good. It adds criminal and civil liability to any platform for knowledge of any violation of sex trafficking laws. Now, let's think about it. Today, with Section 230, the incentive that platforms have is actually to help. And over again, we see platforms helping. We see cases of sex trafficking rings being shut down because the internet company where someone posted ads worked with law enforcement to track down who was involved. They do things, you know, lots of platforms, if they come across illegal activity, will alert the proper authorities. But remember, this new bill says that knowledge makes you liable. So under CESTA, alerting the authorities becomes proof of knowledge. The incentive becomes, don't look at all, don't look at your own platform. Because if you look at your platform, you are creating knowledge that makes you liable. Don't alert the authorities, because that's proof that you knew that you had illegal content on your platform. Don't help at all. That seems incredibly counterproductive if you actually believe in trying to stop sex trafficking. The authors of CESTA, who are supporting this bill, and has tremendous support, and it looks like it's moving very quick, and it may get attached to the defense spending bill, in which case there will be no debate on this bill, and it will be a must-pass bill. They don't seem to understand the important part that I explained earlier, which is Section 2 of Section 230, Part C, which is that you have the incentive now to help. And most platforms do, almost everyone does. But under this new bill, you won't have that luxury. So my final message to conclude here is that you guys need to speak out about why this stuff is so important. About why internet liability protection is so important for everything, for the economy, for the internet, for free speech. And that you guys have built this internet and made it possible. And that's why I'm happy to be stuck in the middle with you, and I hope that you guys remain having the power to build the internet and to enable free speech and to do all of this for you. And with that, I think I have a few minutes for Q&A. I don't know if anyone wants to, or if people want to go to lunch. I don't know if lunch is even ready yet, but that's...
Mike, you might want to ask, to let people know how they can support, apart from being their voices heard, you know, there are trade organizations, nonprofits.
Yeah, sure. So
they may want to be involved and figure out how to be involved with an alliance or partnership.
Sure, yeah, and there's a whole bunch of things. One thing you can do is actually, we created the Copy Institute, and we partnered with an organization called Engine. We created a website called 230 Matters. You can go there and you can see a bunch of information about CESTA in particular, about why Section 230 matters. We also have a letter that's been signed by a bunch of companies, including a bunch of companies who are here. If your organization is interested, please read the letter and think about signing it. We have a setup where you can click and sign, and we'll confirm with you. So that's one thing, but other organizations are doing a lot of work on this. CDT, I'm blanking on what CDT stands for. It used to work for them.
Yeah, Center for Democracy and Technology.
Center for Democracy and Technology. EFF is doing a lot of work on this. Access, there are a whole bunch of different groups. If you do a search on CESTA, there's a law professor, there are a couple of law professors who've been doing a lot of work sort of covering it and covering the problems of it. Eric Goldman has done a lot of work. There's a professor named Alex Levy who is focused on the issue of sex trafficking and who has argued that this would be horrible for sex trafficking and would cause all sorts of problems. But the issue right now is that people in the Senate are really pushing the bill. There's sort of a companion bill in the House, but right now the problem is in the Senate. So look at those organizations, look at our website, 230matters.com, and figure out how to speak out. You can write a letter, if you can call. Seriously, like phone calls to senators actually does make a difference. These things are really important, and if they hear that companies, especially if you happen to be based in the state of senators who are sponsors of the bill, that's extra helpful. And then, yeah, you have a question.
So, as long as I can remember,
yeah.
intermediary liability protection has been under attack, other than
yes.
a handful of times. Has it ever not been?
So has intermediary liability protection ever not been under attack? No, right? It's always been under attack in some form or another. People have always sort of, one of the reasons is that it's easier to target the platforms, right? I mean, for a couple of reasons. One, they're sort of big, obvious, you know where to go. If it's just an individual saying something, online, it's a little tougher to track them down sometimes. Also, especially these days, some of the intermediary the intermediary companies are big, so they have a lot of money, so that becomes sort of the obvious target for legal persons. So they've always been under attack. For the most part, though, the attacks have not gone anywhere. People have sort of accepted that intermediary liability protections are, again, to some extent commonsensical, enough that none of the attacks have really been able to get very far, really, until the last year or so, at least in the sort of US and European context. There are a couple other places where not so much.
There's another aspect there, though, that I think it gives some leverage. When you look at reviews being purged by threat of lawsuit,
yeah.
there are some other anti-competitive tools, which is why I think this will always be under attack.
Sure, there's always... Well, you always have debates, and you can get into a much wider debate about what kinds of content should be allowed online, right? And rather than have that kind of debate, and this debate about there's a free speech, First Amendment debate that's there, what many people have done, both in the public and in the political realm, is basically try and offload that difficult and complicated debate and say, let the platforms handle it. Let the intermediaries handle it. They can take down content. They can take down websites. They can do this. And therefore, it's a way to wash their hands of it.
So do you see part of the solution being switching from centralized platforms to distributed technology, which makes it a little harder to...
Sure. Yeah, so in case people can't hear, he was asking, is the solution that I see to move away from sort of centralized platforms to more distributed platforms? So there's sort of a two-part answer to that. One is yes, right? So if you had a more distributed platform, then obviously it becomes a very different story. The intermediary question becomes a very, very different proposition for a variety of different reasons. The second part of that is that it's not entirely realistic. I wish that it were. I wish that we were moving to a more distributed world. And there are some companies and some individuals and some organizations and some projects that are sort of trying to do that. But what we see, honestly, is more and more, there's centralization. You have these giant silos, right? And so much activity. You have people in the world who think that the internet is Facebook, right? And until we get to a point in which people realize that there are services out there that provide the same kind of benefit, the same kind of power, but in which that are in a more distributed setup. Right now, honestly, the truly distributed platforms tend to be on the margins. They tend to be hackers, and people will play around with them, and they're fun, but they're not getting the sort of critical mass to make them really worthwhile. So yeah, I'm completely supportive of more distributed platforms being out there. It's just
there's a defense argument to be made though, so there's the people you mentioned, and there's people that have no other choice but to use these platforms, and we're seeing that happen in other countries that don't have these protections.
Yeah.
And so the problem with being centralized is by doing this, we put ourselves nationally at greater risk of cyber threat.
Yes.
Other countries that are embracing better technology are more resilient. So we're actually setting ourselves up for
Yes, yeah, there's a monoculture problem, the same as sort of like in the plant world, right? Where if everyone is sort of reliant, you have sort of a central point of attack. And that attack can be, you know, through takedown notices or legal threats or whatever, or it can be some sort of cyber attack. You know, attack can be broadly construed. And so, you know, having a more distributed setup, you know, would protect against that. And so, yes, potentially we're sort of, you know, putting the countries that have this protection at risk. But you know, I wouldn't take that as an argument like, let's destroy intermediary liability protections to force everyone to do more distributed. You know, I don't, that would be sort of a really tricky bridge to.
Let me add one
yeah.
Let me add one thing to that observation, and that's that a lot of people who are here at this conference are competing with in services of people who are much bigger than they are. If your competitors are much bigger than you are, then if the responsibility for compliance is offloaded to your larger competitor, they're able to absorb it maybe,
yes.
But it's harder for you as a startup, or it's harder for you as a newer company with a smaller market share to compete because you maybe don't have the same infrastructure or footprint to do that. So if you value innovation and you value being competitive, you actually need a legal environment that doesn't give a compliance advantage to big companies.
And this is a really huge point, which is like so many of the people who are attacking intermediary liability protections are doing so specifically with, you know, about 3 or 4 companies in mind. And they talk about Google and they talk about Facebook because those are the big ones. And they go with like all this awful content because of all these awful results because of these platforms, and therefore we're going to write this legislation. What they don't recognize or they don't care about, or who knows what, I don't want to necessarily assign motives to it, yeah, perhaps, it is that, you know, those guys, Google and Facebook, have enough money to deal with those threats. They can deal with the regulatory regime that gets put in place. They can deal with the threats. They have lawyers, all these things. Everybody else, not so much. And so if the problem that they say, or the problem that you see, is the sort of centralized, you know, increasing, you know, gravity of these giant silos that are sort of taking over the internet, and as some people think that the idea is like, well, if you undermine these regulations, that'll harm those companies. Well, those guys can weather it. Everybody else goes away. You actually increase the sort of monopoly power of those companies because there's less competition. They can't handle it. I mean, the EU copyright directive, I talked about the filter mandate. You know, there's this ridiculous thing that the EU, and when people said like, that's going to be crazy, and the smaller companies said, you know, we can't afford that. The EU got some quote from a filter provider that said like, oh, well, you know, they say it's only $300 a month. And then you look on their website, it's like, it's $300 a month if you're like processing like 500 items, you know, per month, right? Which, you know, if you're doing that, you're out of business because that's not a business, right? If you're at any sort of scale, it's costing you multiple employees. And so you basically, in that case, you know, you've locked in YouTube and Spotify and the big guys, and you have no more competition, you have no upstarts. And so it would be tremendously destructive.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yes. Yeah. Do we have anything else? We've been having a nice conversation, but yes, Christian.
I actually have more of a statement than a question.
Not allowed! Yeah, use the microphone. Go for it.
I wanted to thank you very much for bringing all these really important issues to the attention of this crowd, but I also wanted to say that I2 Coalition is a trade association that's built exactly to deal with all the types of issues that you're talking about today. And in particular, CESTA is something we're working very heavily on. And so we're built for this industry, we're built for you guys, and we can be a resource for you as well. Come talk to us.
Yes.
And we can keep you informed and plugged
yes,
into that.
and no, that's great. And I2 Coalition actually was very good. They sent it around, when we put together the letter, they sent it around to members, and we got a bunch of I2 Coalition members to sign on to the letter as well. And we've worked with you guys on a bunch of things, and yes, it is a good organization. If you're not currently an active member, please become one. Do we have anything else, or I don't even know what time it is anymore, so.
I think we can wind it up if you want to have any final remarks. So I think we're at final remarks time, and so Mike has said his final remarks. So let me just thank you, Mike. Thank you. Thank you.